Hi, it's Karolyn. I'm here to help you learn how to bake and decorate amazing cakes. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to make this adorable makeup cake. And like always, my cake is already baked, filled, iced, and it's in the refrigerator waiting to be decorated. I have tons of videos showing you how I do that whole process. That is going to be linked in the description. And any tools that I use and any other videos that I reference will be linked down there as well. And I will also let you know how much I charged for this cake. So let's get started. All right, I just got my cake out of the refrigerator. That icing is solid. I need to let it soften up so I can use the impression mat. So I need to let it sit out for about an hour. It's 2:28. I let it sit out until 3:28, and I do it this way. This is just the way that I found that it is the easiest to use impression mats with success. I have a video where I go into detail, and I will link that below. Here's my line impression mat, and of course it has a little crack in it, so I just try not to use that part that has the crack. And I'm just pushing it against the side of the cake and trying to get that impression around the entire thing, and look how pretty that looks. So where it ends, I just make sure that I match it up and continue the pattern all the way around. And it's inevitable whenever you use an impression mat, the top edge kind of gets a little messed up, so I'm just using a wet spatula and using the water just to refine that edge. Now I want to measure my cake to make sure that I print out the 16 topper the right size, and that looks good, so let's put that back in the fridge. Now all of my fondant has this Gum-Tex powder mixed into it. It helps the fondant set hard and makes it so much easier to work with. You knead it into the fondant, roll it out, let it sit, and it just makes it easier to work with. I will link that in the description. So again, I printed that out the size that I wanted it to be so it'll fit on the cake. I have a piece of non-slip pad underneath my cutting board, an X-Acto knife with a wet paper towel, a Dresden tool, and a little bit of water. And I rolled out that black fondant pretty thin, and we are doing my trace, cut, and smooth method to make this topper and all these decorations. So do you see how I'm looking past the word sweet and continuing that number 1? And I am just using my Dresden tool to trace this onto the fondant. Don't press too hard. You don't want to poke a hole. You just want to transfer the line. Don't forget the center pieces as well. And anytime I cut anything out of fondant, I always cut the center pieces first. It's just so much easier to cut and smooth the center pieces before you cut the rest of it out. And I'm going to use my fingers and my tools anytime I cut anything out of fondant to smooth the jagged edges to make it look nice and pretty. And then I'm going to cut the rest of the number out and again smooth those edges because it's just jagged whenever you cut anything out of fondant. And now I rolled out some white fondant about a 1/2 inch thick, and I'm getting a little bit of water on the back of the numbers and sticking that down. And I'm going to have that picture close for reference so I can make sure that I'm putting the number 1 in the right spot. Like I want to have it the correct distance away from the 6. And I'm just using my Dresden tool to refine the edges and making sure they're nice and even. And then this is a thicker piece of fondant. So anytime I cut anything out of thicker fondant, I always just stick the tip of the knife in the fondant to create a guideline. And once I have that guideline done, then I'm going to stick the tip all the way down to the cutting board and cut it out. With that guideline, it makes it so I get cleaner cuts and I don't mess up that top edge of the fondant. And then, of course, I'm going to flip it over, take my fingers on my tools, and smooth my cuts. So you have to smooth the edges. I'm trying to round the edges a little bit, and then I flip it right side up and do the same thing from the top. And then I want to get a skewer in here. So I wet that skewer and I'm screwing it in like a little screwdriver, right? You don't want to jab it in because I don't want to distort the number. And I'm doing it under the 1 and the 6, wherever it's going to touch the cake, making sure it's not poking through the front or the back. And that looks good. I'm going to set that aside to dry flat on a cutting board at room temperature. Now I rolled out some white fondant really thin, and again, trace, cut, and smooth. So I'm tracing this word sweet onto that thin white fondant. Make sure you get all of the inner pieces as well. And then I'm going to cut out all of the inner pieces and smooth those cuts first before I cut out the rest of the word. And then, of course, smoothing my cuts. So that is the process. Trace it onto the fondant, cut it out, smooth the cuts. Trace, cut, smooth, trace, cut, smooth, and you can make all of these pretty decorations. I'm turning that upside down, getting a little bit of water on the back and aligning it on that picture so it's in the right position, take that pink fondant and roll it down on top. And then I easily transferred that word to the pink fondant without getting it distorted. And then the S was separate, so I just got some water behind it and stuck that down. And now I'm cutting an even pink border around the entire word. And again, smooth my cuts when I'm done. And I'm going to set that aside to dry flat, so just leave that out at room temperature. Now I'm doing the same thing for the name. So I measured my cake and then I printed that out the size that I wanted it to be. I believe that font is called Baby Althea, and I will link that in the description. So I'm tracing it onto this black fondant. I'm cutting out all the center pieces first and smoothing those, and then I will cut out the rest of the name and smooth that as well. And then I'm doing the same thing, putting that name upside down on the upside down piece of paper, getting some water on the back, and then aligning that onto the paper so it is in the correct position. Turn that white fondant upside down so the smooth side is facing up, and carefully lay that on top. And voila, the name is perfectly transferred onto the fondant. So again, I want to cut an even white background around this entire name. And then, do I even have to say it anymore? I'm going to take my time and smooth my cuts. And then I don't want this to dry out, so I'm going to store it in a Ziploc bag until I'm ready to put it on the cake. And now I am making the border, so I'm rolling this black fondant out really long, using my ribbon cutter to cut a ribbon, and then use my rulers just to straighten that out. Now I'm getting my cake out of the refrigerator, and I'm taking a wet paper towel just to clean that cake board. And I have some piping gel, and I'm just brushing some piping gel along the bottom of the cake. Start in the back, wrap this around where it meets, cut it, and then press the seam together. And now I'm using my palette knife just to press that down to make sure it's nice and even. Now here's my weird way of making bows. Cut that black fondant in half, align those straight pieces together, and then I'm cutting straight edges on either side. Then lift the fondant up and put it back down so it doesn't stick together, and then I'm cutting that straight edge on the bottom, and then again lift it up so it doesn't stick to itself. And then I'm starting down on one end, go up in the middle, and then come down on the other side. And then I want to lift it up and just smooth those cuts with my fingers, get a little bit of water on one end, fold it in half, fold it up, then down. I'm going to do the same thing for the other one. Get some water, fold it in half, then fold it up, then down. And then I'm going to use my X-Acto knife and just cut those excess pieces off. And then I want to get a little rectangle, and I always fold the edges in. This is for the center. This way it looks a little cleaner. And I'm going to get a little bit of water behind it. And again, all of this fondant has that Gum-Tex powder in it, so it's going to dry hard and hold its shape. Not hard, just stiffer than if it doesn't have it in there. And then I'm getting half the bow on one side, half on the other side, or wrap that up the center, and then wrap it behind the back. And there's the bow. I want the loops to hold its shape, so I have a paper towel, rip it in half, fold it in half again, and then roll from one end to the other and stick that in the loop. So I'm going to do it for the other side. Fold it in half again, roll from one end to the other, and stick it inside. That way it dries to that shape. And now I need to make the tails, so I'm using my ribbon cutter and cutting 2 strips and then cutting that little ribbon detail on the end of both pieces. And then I'm going to go over to my cake. So I have some of that pink icing and a little bit of piping gel, and I don't want this to be center. There's the center of the cake. I want the bow to be a little bit off to the right, so I'm just putting that down. I'm not gluing it down yet, and I'm just shaping this, making the tails look a little wavy. And then once I have them in the correct place, then I will stick it down. So I'm getting a little bit of piping gel behind the ends, and that the bow is going to cover those edges. So as I lift the bow up, you can see how it covers where those tails start. And then I'm just using the handle of my paintbrush to kind of open those loops so they don't collapse in on themselves. And I'm getting a little bit of icing behind the bow where it's touching the pink part of the cake and pressing that down, and that's going to help hold it in the right position. And then I'm going to get a little bit of piping gel behind the tails wherever it's going to touch that bottom black border. And use the handle of my paintbrush again to make sure that it is in the correct position. And that looks really good. Let's put that back in the fridge. Now I am making the makeup. So I rolled out all of that fondant really thin, and I'm rolling this black fondant out a little thicker. I have my ribbon cutter again here, and I'm cutting these long rectangles and smoothing my cuts, and then I make it a little wider and cut it the other way. So I want these same size rectangles for this little makeup palette that I'm making. Get a little bit of water behind it and stick that down. And I want to make sure that they are equidistant, and then I'm going to use my palette knife to straighten everything out. And then this is thicker fondant, so again I want to make a shallow cut first, so I'm using my pizza cutter just to cut a shallow cut with an even border around it, and then I'm sticking it all the way down to the cutting board and cutting it out. And again, flip it over, smooth it out from the back, and then smooth it out from the front, and let's set that aside. Now, I got this roller years ago. I don't think they make it anymore, but I want to put some texture in here. So I'm rolling it on there, turn it 90 degrees, and then rolling it again. I could try to find a similar one and link it below. And it just puts a little pattern in there. You don't have to do that, but I got a circle cutter, and I'm cutting a circle out. And this is going to be highlighter. So I have some pearl dust, and I'm just going to color that just to give it a little sheen. And then I'm going to get a little bit of water behind that and stick that to that thicker piece of black fondant. And then I'm going to get a bigger circle cutter and cut an even black border around that little cream piece and smooth my cuts. And there's a little highlighter. So let's set that aside. And this is going to be hard to explain, but I'm going to try. I'm making the makeup brushes. I wet those skewers under water, and I only want the handle to be about that long. So I'm putting that wet skewer in that black fondant, roll it in my hands, roll it on the countertop, and I want to try to have it to be in the same thickness. So I don't want to press too hard with my fingers. And then I want to cut an even edge. So I rolled that past the end of the skewer, and I'm just cutting that excess fondant off. And then again, I'm cutting that fondant just halfway down the skewer or partway down the skewer, just so I can put the rest of the fondant on there. It will make sense as I go along. So I'm doing this again. I got the fondant around the skewer. I'm cutting the excess off. I want that part to go into the cake board. So I just want a little piece hanging out, and I'm just cleaning up that fondant. And on the other side, I want to have enough room for the head of the brush. So I'm cutting that excess fondant off and pulling that off, and that's where that seam goes. I'm just storing that upside down. Now we need the silver part, so I'm rolling this into a log and making sure that it is the same thickness as that handle. And then I want to cut a straight edge on either side. And then just rolling it out, making sure it's the right thickness, and then carefully cut that in half. And I am just pushing a toothpick through the very center so I can create a hole, so I can slide that down that other stick that I have. So I'm getting a little bit of water on either side and then sliding that down there. It's so much easier to do that if the hole is already made. That way I'm not going to distort that piece, and then just roll it out, making sure it's the same thickness as that black part. I'm going to do the same thing for the other one. Create that hole first. And then I got both of the sides wet, and then just slide that down there and then roll it out. And now I'm making the brush head. So I have that tan fondant. I'm kind of rolling it into a cone shape, and then I'm going to cut off that excess so it will meet that silver piece. So I'm creating a little hole, get it wet, and then slide that down. And I'm just pinching it into place. And then for the other one, I'm making a bigger brush head. So I just rolled it into kind of a cone shape, flattened it out a little bit, and then I'm going to cut that excess piece off. I want to create the hole and then get both sides wet so they stick together, and slide that down there and pinching it on there. And then I'm taking this tool and just making this little detail in the gray section. So I'm just twisting it with my left hand and pushing that detail in there with my right hand. And I did that for both of the brushes. And then I'm using the other end of that tool just to get these brush hairs in the fondant. And now I need to paint the gray silver, so I have that Rolcom Super Silver powder. I will link that below. Mix it with a little lemon extract, and I'm carefully painting this. I'm starting on the back and trying to make sure that I don't paint the black fondant. And then I'm going to flip it over and paint it from the front. And then I want to get a little makeup on the tops of the brushes, so I have a little bit of petal dust, and I'm just brushing that on there. So I used like a cinnamon color, and then I used a darker chocolate color for the bigger brush. And that looks good. Let's set those aside and kind of doing the same thing for the lipstick. So I just cut that skewer in half. I wet the skewer, then I'm wrapping that fondant around it. So I'm rolling it in my hands, rolling it on the countertop, and then cutting the excess off. And I want to have a thickness of like a lipstick, right? So I'm going to store that in a styrofoam block. And then I did the same thing. I rolled out that gray fondant, cut the edges off, got it wet, created that little hole. And then for the pink part, I'm cutting a straight edge on the bottom, and then I'm cutting an angle on the top, and I'm going to smooth my cuts, get a little toothpick in the bottom to create the hole and get that part wet, and then slide that down and then roll it just to make sure it's an even thickness, get that detail in there, and paint it silver. And let's set that aside. Now I have this edible image. I have a video where I show you how I use edible images, and I will link that below. And I'm just cutting this out carefully. I'm going to flip that upside down, get a little bit of piping gel on the back, making sure that I go past the edges so the edges stick down to that thin black fondant that I rolled out, and pushing that down there. And then I'm going to take my X-Acto knife and cut that out, and of course going to smooth my cuts. I'm just going to set that aside to dry. Now I got my cake out of the refrigerator. Let's decorate this. So I don't know where I'm going to put anything, so I'm kind of just putting some of these decorations on the cake and seeing what looks good. So the brush, maybe I'll put that there. Maybe I'll put the palette there. Where should I put the 16? Maybe that will stand up there. So, okay, those skewers are a little long, so I have to take my snips and just trim a little bit off the bottom. I have some of that icing that I'm getting on the bottom wherever it's going to touch the cake. Then I can slide that down, and then I'm going to use my palette knife just to remove any excess icing that's sticking out. And then I play my game of where am I going to put everything. So I'm not gluing it down yet. I'm just placing these on here. I thought the head of the brush should go to the other side because there was too much going on the left side of the cake. So I got a little bit of icing underneath that lipstick, and then used a dry paintbrush to remove the excess. Maybe I'll put that there. So I'm just going to set that there until I figure this out. I'm getting a little bit of icing behind the name and a little bit of piping gel on the edges, and then sticking that to the cake. And then get a little icing behind that and stick that down. I have to create a little hole in the cake board, so I'm holding that up where it's going to go, and then taking half a toothpick and hammering that down there to create the hole. And then I'm going to pull that toothpick out. That way I can easily stick that down into the cake board. So I'm getting a little bit of piping gel behind it where it's going to touch the cake. And then where am I going to put that sweet? I think that looks good down there. Should I keep these here? I don't know. I feel like it looks a little busy. So I got some piping gel behind that. And I don't like that lipstick up there. I think I'm going to move that down there and put the highlighter in the back. Yeah, I think that looks good. So I have to trim that excess skewer so it fits in there. And again, I have to create a hole in the cake board. So I'm hammering that half toothpick down there and then lift it up and create that hole. And then get some piping gel underneath where it's going to touch the cake board. And I can easily slide that down into that hole I created. I'm getting some icing behind the brush where it's touching the cake to help it stand up straight, and take my dry paintbrush and remove any excess icing. Get some icing underneath that makeup palette, and I'm going to stick that down. And then I want to stick the brush down. So I'm getting a toothpick under the one side and getting some piping gel underneath the handle and pushing that down as well. And I'm getting some non-toxic glue around that perimeter and on the back of that ribbon and pressing the ribbon down. And taking a dry paintbrush to remove any cornstarch. And now I feel like this needs curlies. Here's my curly container because I'm crazy curly obsessed. And here's how you make curlies. You cut a straight line, cut a squiggly line down on either side so it comes to a point, and then wrap it around a Dresden tool. And I just always keep the excess. So I have piping gel that I'm getting underneath each of these little pieces on the top of the cake and on the cake board. And here is the cake. How cute! So there you go. How cute is this cake? This one was so much fun to make. Just a little note on the impression mat. I do it weird. The way that I use impression mats is the only way that I found that I can do it without having the icing stick to it. So I frost the cake and I put it in the refrigerator overnight. The icing solidifies, then I have to take it out of the refrigerator, let the icing get soft, and then use that impression mat against the cake. That is the only way that I have been able to do it where the mat won't stick to the cake. If I try to use the mat right after I frost the cake, then it's going to stick to the icing and it's a nightmare. Trust me, this process is a little longer, but it's totally worth it because it's effective. Now, I use American Buttercream, and that is a crusting buttercream, so that's why I can push the mat against it and it's not going to stick. I've never personally worked with meringue buttercreams. They do not form a crust, so I'm not sure how to use impression mats on meringue buttercream. So this cake on the inside is a 2-layer torted 7-inch cake, and I have a video talking about when I tort and when I don't tort my cakes, and I'm going to link that in the description. It feeds about 16 to 20 people. She originally asked it to feed 12 to 16, but I made it slightly bigger just so I can fit more stuff on the top, and I do that from time to time. It's always nice to go a little bit above and beyond for people. How much would you charge for this design? I charged $275. So I think that's it. What new techniques did you learn in this video? I would love to know. Leave it in the comments below. And just a reminder, I have a KakeAcademy membership program where I can help you elevate your cakes to the next level. All of that information is linked in the description. Please like this video if you liked it, and if you're enjoying my tutorials, I would be so grateful if you could buy me a coffee. My link is down below. And I would love it if you would keep in touch on socials and you could check out my website. And if you want to stick around, you can watch this video next and hit subscribe and the bell if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching. I love you guys. And remember, it's cake. Have fun. I will see you on the next one. Bye.